So our next speaker is Mark Spencer, who's Vice County Recorder for London and Middlesex. He's a forensic botanist, he's a broadcaster, and he's author of the most amazingly titled book, Murder Most Florid.
Thank you very much for introducing me, Julia, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Tristan, for raising the rafters for amenity grassland. So many of London's most vulnerable habitats are so-called amenity grassland. I'm going to start this talk off to mention something which I always talk about when I talk about forensics and the work I do, because I'm involved in serious crime, is the fact that I'm not going to be showing anything that is gratuitously violent or visceral by many people's standards today. And all the casework that I talk about is all thoroughly anonymized, because I don't believe it's appropriate, with sensibilities as are these days, to talk about individual cases in a way that is recognizable to the wider public. So without that, I'm just going to say one or two other words about what is forensic ecology. Forensic ecology is sometimes confused with environmental forensics. Now, environmental forensics is essentially generally referring to things like pollution events and using scientific information to unpick how something like pollution or Southwest Water putting loads of sewage into the Solent, for example, can be applied. Forensic ecology is the discipline embodying forensic botany, which is what I am, but also includes soil science, entomology, which the Natural History Museum's had a long-standing involvement with. And actually, my involvement with forensic ecology started here in the Natural History Museum when I used to look after the British Herbarium. So my casework, as I say, is essentially forensic botany. It's fair to say, like many people involved in natural history and the natural world, I've got a reasonable grasp of other disciplines, although I'm not too good when it comes to things like birds and other things with faces. But this is the kind of casework I do. And as you can see, it's a pretty horrifying list. Most of the work I do involves murder, attempted murder. I do quite a lot of work around sexual violence, sexual assaults, etc. And to lesser extent these days, arson, burglary, but I've also had some casework around domestic terrorism and wildlife crime. As you can see from that list, it's a pretty challenging list, and it's fair to say forensic botany is right in there, often it's not in the visceral elements of what it is to be involved in this casework. And I do experience and see things that many people would find very, very disturbing and challenging. It's also fair to say that with a list like that, we have to go through quite a lot of vetting. So I am given sort of various forms of security clearance every few years to see that I'm a suitable person to be doing such work. Bizarrely, being an expert witness, which is the ability to, essentially walk into the courtroom and present your botanical scientific evidence, is not so thoroughly gatekeepered. Certain elements of forensics are very thoroughly gatekeeped, particularly archaeology, but pretty much anybody could describe themselves as a forensic botanist. Other aspects of the work I do is around other aspects of civil work, or, for example, suicide or suspected suicide or accidental death. In many cases, I'll be working on a scene where initially we don't actually know what has happened to the person. So one thing that's often said about or perceived about in forensic ecology and forensic botany is that it's a new discipline. It's not the case. It's actually got its roots going back many, many, many decades, if not hundreds of years, arguably. This is probably one of the most famous cases in the history of forensic botany. This is the case of the crime of the century, as it was so called, the murder of Charles Lindbergh Jr., the son of the world-famous aviator. There's much written about this case. It's one of these controversial cases which involve, all sorts of conspiracy theory about whether the suspect and the man who was ultimately charged and found guilty, Bruno Hauptmann, was framed by other people and or possibly the police. But the one of the elements that stands the test of time is the robustness of the forensic botany that was done by a wood anatomist from Wisconsin. There's lots and lots written about this. I just wanted to raise this up. You can see all sorts of interesting pieces of information about this case online. So I just want to delve into a little bit more detail about my own personal experiences and what I do. First and foremost, and frankly the hardest, are what we refer to as MISPers, or missing person searches. This is about going out into the landscape and looking for somebody who's gone missing, being believed to have been murdered, for example, or accidental death. In many cases, these are scenarios where somebody could have been missing for 1 year, 2 years, 10 years, 20 years. These are the most technically difficult and frustrating and challenging of the pieces of my work. And in heading towards 15 years of doing environment and forensic ecology now, I've had one success because, or the team I've been working with has had one success because I'm part of a larger thing. It is a very, very difficult thing to do because before you even look at the landscape and the environment, which I'll be talking about in a moment, you have to have the other elements of the case in the right piece of the landscape. So if the police intelligence is incorrect, whether the mobile phone data is actually giving you a useful piece of information, or other pieces of information such as witness statements are key to actually this process for the police. So missing person searches are really, really difficult. Deposition scene or site examinations are much easier in many respects to deal with because you are dealing with examining somebody's remains in the landscape, and this is where people are very surprised. People think that forensic botany is a lab-based activity, that I'm working far from the scene. Actually, in many cases, it's fundamentally important for somebody such as me to be there at the time of recovering somebody's remains. So I work very closely in this time period to actually recover as much information as possible, sometimes with additional work on things like entomology. I don't do the entomological work, but I will on occasion collect the material for the police. And other things I'll be doing will be estimating time frames, how long this is, I'll talk about in a little bit more detail in a moment, assessing landscape damage and activity, understanding actually how vegetation is being affected by human activity, and then retrieving the relevant data, plant material, etc. for other casework. So this is a fairly typical environment that's very familiar to us, as you know, as amateur natural historians, professional natural historians, and people interested in botany and the landscape. This is very familiar to us, but this is deeply unfamiliar for your average crime scene investigation, because most violent crime in this country happens in the workplace, in the home, and on the street. In many cases, police forces are completely at sea with this green and weird stuff. I've become very, very surprised, well, less surprised now, but initially, about how people are not used to being able to interpret things like growth, time, change, age, landscape history. And this is one of the things I think is really important for all of us as a botanical community. We are so used to internally our own knowledge and skills base that we're not very good at communicating to the rest of science what botany actually is. They tend to think, those of us who are not botanists, that it's about looking at a flower, giving it a name. There's very little understanding that botany is a synthesis of a wide range of pieces of information that help us build up an understanding of why plants are there and what they're doing, etc., etc. And I spend quite a bit of time in my casework explaining to police these undulations in landscape and what they mean. I work very closely, often as not, with forensic archaeologists. I suspect many of you will be familiar with this particular, because this is one of Britain's most important and famed orchid sites, just down here, looking out over the River Thames. But I put this up here because this exemplifies something very important, which is that each type of landscape, whether it be woodland, water, grassland, all pose very, very different questions. Some of you may have seen or heard me talk about brambles, but brambles are my pet plant in many cases for the forensic world, because brambles often tend to grow alongside where people's remains are lying in the landscape, and if they've been there for a number of years, the vegetation structure of a bramble plant in wrapping and encapsulating somebody's remains can be very useful for providing a chronology. And this can be invaluable information in the first hours of investigation, because if the person hasn't got their credit card on them or whatever it might be that's sitting next to them, having an understanding that the person went missing 8 or 9 years ago can be invaluable in the early stages of an investigation. So in this particular case, this was actually one of my first cases, actually. This was very close to the skull of a man. You can see that different shading of degradation of the stems of the bramble, ultimately, with a little bit of practice and extra plant material around it, can give you an understanding of how many years that plant has been there. Now, the element that probably comes closest to public understanding of what somebody like might do is trace evidence, using vegetation and fragments or pollen or et cetera, to link a suspect to a crime scene. This, again, is actually quite challenging because us botanists usually identify plants from nice, intact root material. We like to look at a whole plant, a whole herbarium specimen. We're not used to dealing with horrible bits of vegetation which are stuck on the car wheel arch, on the spade, or sometimes actually in contact with all sorts of horrible fluids. So it is often very, very challenging material that we have to work with. And this is where I come to the point again about, Tristan's emphasised this, about the importance of biological data and natural history and biological recording and museology. And these are just a couple of examples. These were actually I used for a paper I wrote recently, just to exemplify how biological records can be invaluable in helping police investigate where somebody has been. So if you have the top one, does anybody recognise what the top one is? Well, it's Rhodes, yes, bang on. It's actually Cochlearia danica, one of the things that is famously, so the distribution of a plant can be very highly informative for where somebody has been in the landscape. If I had a trace of a piece of Cochlearia danica, for example, in somebody's footwear on the edge of a housing estate, you could link this. The lower one is actually chalk and is actually the distribution of botanical records for rock rose, common rock rose, Helianthemum. Now, this data that we've collected is massively valuable and potentially really useful in crime scene work. I've had 2 or 3 recent cases where biological distributional data such as this has helped demonstrate where a murder suspect has been. And we don't really appreciate actually how valuable our data is as a community for society across many, many elements. The other side of this is museum collections, because as I say, very often I will be looking at a fragment of material that may have been retrieved from somebody's clothing or their digestive tract, because I do that sometimes, and having a herbarium specimen to compare and validate my observations is absolutely invaluable, because it is one thing to be a very confident botanist and walk in and say, I'm Dr. Mark Spencer and I've identified this plant, but that is always a risky strategy if you've got a particularly aggressive barrister in front of you. If you can then say, and I validated my observation with this really lovely specimen from the Natural History Museum, it strengthens your presentation in the court. So natural history objects are really, really valuable in forensics. This is an example actually many years ago from a case of arson, where a man had tried to burn a building down, and he was caught very, very luckily by a police officer who actually arrested him, and he found these 3 leaf fragments and that flower on his clothing. We were able to demonstrate that they came from the crime scene, nowhere else, and actually with the help of the Natural History Museum collections, that it wasn't a plant growing anywhere wild in the vicinity, and he was subsequently found guilty. So just to finish off, the really valuable thing about this little piece of my botanical life is that it's underpinned by the valuable data that amateur natural historians and also museum collections bring to bear and help our society. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Wonderful to see the links to all you're doing there. I think we've got time for one brief question. Any questions?
You mentioned brambles as being one of your indicator plants. You've also mentioned nettles.
Yes.
Can you explain further, please?
Well, nettles are interesting because they're nitrophiles. They grow vigorously in nutrient-rich environments. And actually, there's this widespread belief, both within the wider public and also in UK policing, that you can identify a person in the ground through a profusion of growth of plants such as nettles. It's not true, unfortunately. It's much, much more complicated than that. I don't have time to go into it. But nettles, when you go down below ground, are really, really handy, like brambles, for time frames, because the rhizomatous root systems and the underground structures of nettles, again, have a consistent annual pattern. And actually, once you understand the growth pattern of nettles, you can actually look at their growth across a piece of landscape and go 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 4 year, 5 year. So on some occasions, I've used nettles to help create an understanding of time frame, but they're not so good for looking for dead bodies underground per se.
Thank you, Mark. So